My name is Paul Edwards. I direct the Wheatley Institution at Brigham Young University. And it's my pleasure this morning to welcome you to this webinar that we have, an opportunity to discuss the book, The Upswing, with its authors, Robert Putnam and Shaylyn Romney Garrett. As we get underway, I want to thank several people who are working behind the scenes to make things happen here. We're very grateful to Lisa McPhee, Professor Putnam's assistant at the Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government, and our student interns and staff here at the Wheatley Institution, Sam Francis, Kiki Manning, and Kelly Nicolaisen. The chat area of the Zoom platform has a rich amount of detailed information about today's speakers and about the book, The Upswing, including a link to the publisher's page. And although the interactive functions of the Zoom chat are disabled, we do want you to make liberal use of the question function as we hope to get to your questions a little later. As you know, it's our tradition to begin our events in prayer, and I have asked Professor Kelly Patterson, a professor in the political science department here at Brigham Young University, to offer an invocation on today's proceedings. Kelly?
Our Father in heaven, we are so grateful to thee this day that we may gather together to hear the work of these marvelous scholars. We are grateful for their work and their dedication and their willingness to share with us. We ask that thou wilt bless us with the spirit of meekness to be able to consider and learn. We are grateful for all that thou hast given us. We acknowledge thy hand in all things. We say this in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much, Kelly. Well, we are very honored today to welcome to campus, if only virtually, Robert Putnam and Shaylyn Romney Garrett. And I think they've come up on screen there. So Shaylyn Romney Garrett's work really defies simple categorization. Although the term social entrepreneur might provide a starting point for us. A fuller list of her interests and accomplishments can be found in the chat section, and I encourage you to go and look at that. But to give you a sense of Shaylyn, she and her husband, James, who now live in Washington County, Utah, down in southwestern Utah, with their two young children, were Peace Corps volunteers in Jordan who stayed past their term of service in order to start a nonprofit called Think Unlimited that helps Jordanian school teachers teach creative thinking and problem solving. Since returning home, she's become a founding contributor to the Aspen Institute's Weave Initiative, a social fabric project that we heard a little about when David Brooks was on campus with us last year. And her work on creating community and connection has been highlighted in the New York Times, in Fast Company, in Harvard Business Review, and other publications. Shaylyn is also a gifted writer. I've heard in other settings, Robert Putnam describe her as one of his very best undergraduate students in all of his decades of teaching at Harvard University. The two of them have collaborated before The Upswing, notably on the book American Grace. Shaylyn, we're honored to welcome you to Brigham Young University, which I understand is your parents' alma mater.
It is. I'm so glad to be here. Thank you.
We're so glad to have you with us. Now, Professor Robert Putnam is no stranger to Brigham Young University. He was our Constitution Day Forum speaker in 2006. I recognize that for most of our current students, that would have been about the same time you were all starting kindergarten. But perhaps more important are his important intellectual ties to Brigham Young University. His brilliant work, American Grace, How Religion Divides and Unites Us, is a project, as I noted, Shaylyn contributed to, and it was co-authored by BYU alumnus David Campbell. And his emphasis on this interplay between social connectedness, what social scientists call social capital, and moral agency is in a lot of ways the lived experience of so many practicing Latter-day Saints. His book, Bowling Alone, The Collapse and Revival of American Community, became what I've called elsewhere a decade-defining book, because what it revealed to us about long-term trends in America leading towards social fragmentation. And by my count, Putnam has authored at least 12 other major books in addition to the 3 we've already mentioned here. Putnam's undergraduate work was at Swarthmore. He was a Fulbright scholar at Oxford. He did his graduate degrees at Yale University. And Professor Putnam, as we're going to see today, has developed a most extraordinary gift for crunching vast amounts of data about social phenomena in order to help reveal broad long-term patterns. And like all true masters of their craft, he makes that detailed background work look effortless as he shares it in memorable metaphors and accessible prose. So, Robert, welcome back to Brigham Young University.
Thanks very much, Paul. It's good to be here. And as you well know, I prefer to be called Bob. When people call me Robert, it means they're trying to sell me something. And I'm delighted to be here, back here. As you say, I've got a lot of deep, warm ties with BYU.
Now, as I said, as we talked about this earlier, this is sort of an airsats visit, right? So we're looking forward to the time when you can come out. We'll have Shaylyn drive up from Southern Utah, and we'll have a richer conversation. And we hope that that happens in the not too distant future.
Terrific.
So, last time you were here, Bob, you were sharing Bowling Alone, and but as you ended that great forum address to the campus community, you actually sort of gave a hint about where things were going with your thoughts and work that have led to the Upswing, and you challenged our students to look back to the year 1906 as an example of a moment when there was tremendous fragmentation, but Americans were coming together in interesting ways. How on earth does 1906 have anything to do with a pandemic-ridden 2021 in the modern United States?
Well, first of all, Paul, it's terrific to be back. I share great admiration for the mission of BYU, and actually for the mission that many Latter-day Saints engage in as part of their maturing process. I would, if I try to put this most recent book in the context of all the work that I've been doing, and in particular in the context of Bowling Alone, I would say that this new book is both broader and longer, if I can put it that way. First of all, compared to Bowling Alone, which focused only on social capital, connections among people, this new book does look at social capital, connections among people, but also looks at trends in economic inequality, trends in political polarization, and trends in culture, trends in the degree to which we Americans think of ourselves as all of this together, or conversely, the degree to which we think of ourselves as, you know, it's each of us is in it for what's good for us, and the devil take the hindmost. So we look at those 4 dimensions in this new book, and we also look at over a much longer period of time. We look at at as you've indicated, we look at what was happening in America beginning around 1890 and then coming forward all the way to now. So the new book, as I say, is both longer in its historical span and broader in the things that it covers. Actually, I don't know, Paul, if you're able now to call up my PowerPoint, but if you are, I can just pick up from right here and show a little bit more visually what some people are numbers people and some people are stories people. And as you indicated, I'm a numbers person, although I love stories. And Shaylyn is good at numbers, but she's the story specialist. And so I want to show a couple of graphs, charts that illustrates what we're talking about. And then Shaylyn will take over and say what it all means and what lessons we want to extract from it. So if we can have the next slide, please. The book, as I've already said, looks at trends over time in 4 dimensions of society: politics, political polarization, economics, economic inequality, society, social isolation, and culture, the degree to which our culture is self-centered or not. And as the headline here says, the fact is America today has reached historic levels of all of those things. We're about as polarized as we have ever been in our history. The only close rival, actually, is the period of the Civil War. We're very close to that Civil War level. I don't mean we're going to have a armed conflict in America anytime soon, but I do mean that the level of political difference and hostility across party lines is as great as it's ever been. Also, we're at a level of political inequality that's almost without parallel in American history. And we're very isolated and lonely today, and we're also very culturally self-centered. I would almost say narcissistic. And so one of the questions we want to ask here, and I'm going to show it in some graphs, is how did we get here? If we have the next slide, it'll give me a chance to say a little bit about what I mean when I say how did we get here. The horizontal axis in all of these charts, by the way, if you're not a numbers person, that's fine. Just settle back and relax. And then in a second, Shaylyn will start talking in ordinary language, and then she'll tell the same story. This is trends in political polarization or political comedy. That's the other side of it, political bipartisanship. And up here is political bipartisanship, political comedy getting along together. So down is polarization. And you can see that in 1890, America was very polarized, very low political bipartisanship in that period, just as at the end of the 19th century. But then you can see, beginning at the beginning of the 20th century, we begin to see a little more cross-party collaboration. Still not a lot, but a little bit more. We'd begun to move in the direction of greater bipartisanship and cooperation, and that trend continues through the teens and the 20s, and through the 30s, and through the 40s, and through the 50s, and then into the 1950s. If we stop for just a second, you can see the very top point here was the middle 1950s, and that the president at that point, you may remember from your history classes, the president in the middle 50s was a guy named Dwight Eisenhower, who all historians agree was the least partisan president in American history, except for George Washington. So he didn't cause this depolarization, this rise of cross-party collaboration, but he symbolized it. And then moving from there, however, as we get into the 60s, and then especially as we get into the 70s, we begin to have more polarization, less bipartisan cooperation, and that trend continues down steadily through the 80s, through the 90s, through the 2000s, through the and into the current decade. And in fact, although we don't have the numbers here showing the graph for them for the last 5 years, actually we know what the numbers are, and it continues further down. So now we're way down at the bottom in terms of cross-party collaboration, or to put it differently, we're amazingly polarized. And that chart, as you see, covers a long period of time. Let me preface this just by add a note here by saying, if you go back up to the middle 2000s, about 2007, 2008, something like that, that's when Donald Trump, right in there, Donald Trump begins to appear in American politics what I'm trying to show you is Donald Trump certainly did not cause this downturn. It was been going on for almost 50 years before he even appears on the scene. If anything, Donald Trump is kind of a symptom of this trend. The problems did not start when he entered the White House, and they're not going to start if he's now out of the White House for a while. That's politics. Let's go now quickly to economics. And again, here you can see the graph begins over at the beginning of the 20th century. Here the data actually began, the hard data began in 1913, because that's when the IRS was created, and that's when we begin to have really hard data. And you can see when the curtain rises to our data here, it's already extreme. America's extremely unequal, and probably we're even more unequal in that earlier period before we begin to have really hard data. But then beginning in about almost beginning instantly in 1913, we begin to become a little less unequal, a little more equal. There's a pause during the 1920s. That's the roaring 20s. But then coming out of the 20s, even before the recession, in the Depression, you can see we're beginning to be more equal. And that trend upward continues during the 30s and during the 40s and even after a little pause in the late 40s and the 50s and into the 60s. Now, let me emphasize, even up at the top there, America does not become a completely equal society. We're not like a commune in which everybody has the same income. Of course not. But compared to other places in the real world, like even Sweden, which is a notoriously equal place, America looked at that point a sort of lot like Sweden in terms of the gap between rich and poor. But then gradually that begins to change, and we begin to become more unequal. The distribution of income becomes more, the gap between rich and poor becomes bigger and bigger. And again, the trend continues inexorably downward through the 1980s, into the 1990s, through the 1990s, and way down at the bottom, we almost hit bottom in about 2015 when this chart stops. But then again, we know what the numbers look like since then. Since 2015, there's been an even greater increase in inequality or decline in economic equality. And so now we're back down where we started in a very extremely unequal America. Let's go to the next slide, please. Here we're going to be talking about social cohesion, or what I called social capital, in my book, Bowling Alone. And again, you see, actually, America, Shaylyn will explain a little bit more what this means, what it looked like in real life. But America at the turn of from the 19th to the 20th century, in the late 1890s, America was very fragmented and socially isolated. And only gradually around the turn of the century, once again, did that begin to change. We begin to become a little more socially cohesive. And again, you see this same steady rise during the teens and 20s, a pause, again, that pause during the 20s, but then coming out of the Great Recession, the Great Depression, and World War II, probably the greatest boom in civic history and civic boom in American history. Every group in America more people were joining, and in general, in that period, we became ever more connected with one another in many, many ways, in terms of social trust, in terms of the family, in terms of organizational involvement, and so on, until in the middle 60s, suddenly, again, silently, mysteriously, we begin to become less connected. And so membership in all those organizations begins to decline. There's been a decline, as we'll see in a moment, in family and in church, and certainly in social trust. Social trust begins to plummet here. That is, trust in other people. And up at the top, we've been pretty trusting in other people, but by the time we get to the 60s and 70s and 80s, we're less and less trusting, and that trend just continues absolutely downward. Bowling Alone is published in 2000. So go back up to 2000 for a moment. That's when Bowling Alone was published. And Bowling Alone, the story of Bowling Alone is basically the story. The story is told in Bowling Alone beginning around 1960 and goes to 1990 or 2000 when it was published. But you can see it just continued after I wrote the book. It still continued. I was trying to get people to join, but it nevertheless just continued to go down and down and down and down. Now, I want to show you, partly because this is BYU, I want to show you something about other trends that are part of the same trend. This is a trend in membership in church congregations. how many people, what fraction of American adults in any given year belong to some religious congregation. And you can see it begins amazingly in the same place. America was a very unchurched place. I don't mean we were all atheists, but America just didn't belong to churches. Only 45% of all American adults back in 1890 belonged to any religious organization at all. But then that begins, you can see, begins to rise. And it again, the same basic pattern, steady increases, maybe a little bit of a pause in the 20s, but then steady increases. And especially after World War II, a huge boom in church attendance reaches its peak. And amazingly, 1964, just about the same time that all these other curves were peaking out. And then it turns down in the same basic pattern. Up at the top, 80% of Americans belong to some congregation. That keeps dropping steadily, keeps dropping steadily until we get to where we are now, in which we're almost back. And actually, that continues down. If we showed the data all the way down to 2020, we'd be back where we started before. We started in 45% of us being church members. At the peak, there was about almost twice as many as a fraction of the population belonging to church, and now we're back down where we started. Let's have the next slide, which just looks at family and marriage. This is one particular example of family. Back in the late 19th century, there were lots of people who remained unmarried forever. The language back there was bachelors and spinsters. It seems very old-fashioned, and of course it is old-fashioned. But again, relatively few people married, and the graph doesn't show this, but if you did get married, you got married very late, and you tended not to have many kids. And that you can see that begins to change about 1900, the same period, about around 1900, we begin to have slightly more people getting married, and they're getting married slightly older, and they're having more kids. And then beginning in 1940, a huge boom. Beginning in 1940, you see rapid increases in the number of people who are getting married. People are marrying at much earlier levels. In that period, most Americans, like my wife Rosemary and I, we got married in our 20s. Nowadays, our kids, who come from a later generation, can't imagine why we were getting married at such an early age. But then, and that was, of course, the baby boom. So families was a big deal in 1960. But again, timing is amazingly similar, begins to drop. And more and more people are remaining unmarried, or if they do get married, they get married very late, and they have fewer and fewer kids. And then that comes all the way down to the bottom, where you can see now many Americans, many young people, and this will be familiar to the folks watching this, many young people in America now, not including Mormons, many young people in America now don't ever plan to get married. They plan not to have kids. And this is what's happening nationwide in America. Of course, I'm aware, and you are too, that on the role of family and marriage and having kids and so on, members of the LDS are quite different. Let's go to the next slide. I'm back now to talking about general life in America. And finally, this is a curve that shows trends in cultural solidarity, basically the degree to which people either feel we're all in this together, that's up at the top, we're all kind of a strong community, or we're in it for ourselves, and it should be that way. Shaylyn will say a little bit more about this measure in her remarks. She's about to begin talking a little bit more about the story that lies behind these charts. But if you go back down to the beginning in 1890, America in the 1890s was a very self-centered, very narcissistic culture. People were mostly in it for themselves and thought they should be mostly in it for themselves, and they thought the devil take the hindmost. But then again, isn't this uncanny? Beginning in the first decade of the 20th century, that begins to change. More and more people begin saying, no, we ought to worry about other people too. And again, you see the same upward trend, the same pause in the 1920s, but then coming out of the 20s, steady increases in the number of people who are focused on we and not on I. And that hits a peak up in 1964, it looks like. And again, the same downward trend. Now we're moving that period, the last 50 years, we've been moving more and more, putting an emphasis on I and not an emphasis on we. And therefore, Shaylyn and I call this the I, we, I curve, because it begins with I in the 1890s, goes up to we in the 1960s, and then comes back down to I in where we are today. If we go to the next slide, this shows you how all four of those numbers fit together, and you can see the trend for economics and the trend for politics and the trend for society and the trend for culture, and they're all the same curve. So we could easily just put them in one curve. It's an amazing empirical fit. I wish we had more time to talk about the math of it. It's just astonishing that these curves are all so close to the same. But if you show the next slide, you'll see that's the story of the book. That's the basic empirical evidence for the big trends that have moved American society over this last 125 years. But now Shaylyn is going to pick up the story here, and she's going to tell you what's the actual story, what's the narrative that lies behind this story, and what lessons can we learn from this period too. Shaylyn, why don't you pick up there?
Sure. Thanks, Bob. So if there's one thing that Americans agree upon today, it's that we're in a mess. And it's a multifaceted crisis, as Bob has pointed out. And a lot of books have actually been written in the last decade or so that have tried to unpack how we got here, right? And many of them focus on one of these trends, maybe economics, maybe society. And they usually only focus on this fall from grace that has happened over the last half century. Of course, the difference of this book is that we're looking at a broader picture. And what we're arguing in the upswing is that it turns out that looking to the moment when this upswing culminated turns out not to be very instructive. Looking to the moment that it started is more fruitful, especially because the moment that it started looked so similar to today. So if ever there were a historical moment whose lessons we need to learn, it's the moment when the Gilded Age gave way to the Progressive Era, or the moment when the last upswing started. There was a determined group of reformers that came onto the scene and really set in motion a sea change for our society. The lesson here is that we have successfully weathered a storm like the one we're in now once before, and we can do it again. And we really hope that looking back to this period, to the 1906 period that Paul highlighted at the beginning of this discussion, might give us some insights as to how we could potentially see another upswing happen today. So let's go to the next slide and look at a few of the lessons from this period. So before I jump into these bullet points, I want to just say one thing here. Now, this is a statistical story, as Bob has said. And so if you have data, you have hard statistical data, then you know what turns when. And that might mean that you could look at all these different trends and say, if I could identify what was the leading indicator, or what was the thing that started going upward first, then you might think, well, that's the silver bullet. If we tinker with that one thing, maybe it'll bring the rest of society with it. And a lot of times social scientists assume that economics is the leading indicator. I think that we have sort of a vaguely Marxist view of history in the sense that economics leads everything and the rest is just details. What's fascinating about this data is that it's very clear that economics was not the leading indicator. It was actually a clear lagging indicator, meaning that we moved in the direction of economic equality after other things started to change first, which is a really fascinating finding. And I think something that, especially for Bob going into this, he likes to talk about how counterintuitive that was in terms of a finding. So if we know that economics isn't the leader in this story, then what is? So it's a little bit hard to tell. There's so many scores of data sets that we're looking at when we look at these curves. It's a little bit difficult to say what turned first, right? It's a little bit like looking at a flock of birds in flight and they all switch direction immediately. It's hard to say which one went first. But when you sort of pair the statistical data with the historical record, it becomes somewhat clear that what turned first here was actually culture, which I think, again, for social scientists at least, is a surprising finding. And what did that culture look like during the Gilded Age? Well, the Gilded Age was characterized, as Bob alluded to, by a very narcissistic culture that historians have called social Darwinism. It was the idea of taking Darwin's descriptive thesis of the survival of the fittest being the law of nature and applying that to society as a good way to organize society, basically considering society to be one giant competition. only the strong will survive. I choose that phrase carefully because for those of you who think, oh, that's a very strange cultural ethos, that's very foreign. Well, only the strong survive is a direct quote from the mayor of Colorado City, Texas, who just a week or so ago said that that was the rule in the wake of a huge disaster being faced in Texas, that only the strong will survive. It's every man for himself. So if you think this is an unfamiliar ethos, it is showing up in surprisingly striking ways today. So the social Darwinism of the Gilded Age was the reigning ethos. And then we had a movement come on the scene called the social gospel. This was a movement that came out of evangelical Protestantism, and it was really theologians on the front end of this looking at Christianity specifically, Christian theology, and saying, this idea of the city up on the hill, like, and the unwashed masses below is not what Christ believed was the way we should organize our society. On the contrary, Christ taught that societies are about taking care of our most vulnerable and what we can do for one another and what we can achieve together. And these social gospelers started articulating this new vision for American society rooted in a reinterpretation of Christian theology. And it started off as a movement in religiosity, but it really became a more broad cultural ethos in America. And this was not a moral awakening that was just about identifying the guilty parties and expelling the bad apples from society. On the contrary, the historian Richard Hofstadter has called this period a moral indignation or a moral awakening directed inward. In large measure, the progressive reformers were elites, not all of them, but a lot of them were elites who were beginning to question their own complicity in a system that was highly unequal, super polarized, very dislocating. And they started to have moral moments that turned them away from living in this I-focused narcissistic direction and moving in the direction of we. So who were these people? They were largely young. Most of the progressive reformers were under the age of 30 when they started doing their most important work. We believe that today the same thing will be true. Another lesson from this era is that these reformers took relationship building very seriously. The word that they used to describe it, which is kind of an antiquated term in our language, but the word is association building. They were very focused on bringing people together. They were actively fighting the hyper-individualism of their age. And the reason for that is because these people had lived, these young people, these young reformers had lived through the Industrial Revolution. Their parents had grown up on farms and in small towns, but they were now living in big, busy, isolated, commercially driven cities. And the old ways of bringing people together, the quilting bees and the barn raisings, just weren't going to cut it on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. And so they were literally inventing new ways of bringing people together. And as a result of that, they created vast new stores of social capital that really fueled this upswing for decades. You had settlement houses and civic organizations and service organizations that were creating face-to-face ties, especially amongst unlike groups. Another feature of this was that these reformers were turning their moral indignation, translating that outrage into citizen engagement. Again, they weren't just out there decrying the moral decay of society. They said, if we're going to right the ship, we've got to take the reins and do something ourselves. They were really reclaiming their individual agency in the face of these vast cultural and economic shifts that were changing society. And they said, we're in control of the future here. And they began to work in what one progressive called the laboratories of democracy, the cities and the towns and the small neighborhoods, working to solve problems right outside their door. And many of those solutions, once they were proven at the local level, actually then bubbled up to inspire the big national programs that we often think of as characterizing the progressive era. The trust busting and the national income tax and the child labor legislation had their roots in local innovations that local grassroots reformers were working on right in their neighborhoods. So this was a really grassroots-led movement. Which leads me to my next point, which is that the charismatic political leadership actually was another lagging indicator. We often think that movements like this are made by a charismatic leader who gets out there and articulates a new vision and brings everybody behind him. And sometimes we think of Teddy Roosevelt as being this figure in this historical period. That actually turns out not to be true. Teddy Roosevelt was really more of a political entrepreneur who saw a parade and got out in front of it and managed to translate this popular uprising into policies and programs that had bipartisan appeal. And so a lot of lessons here. If we're going to look for another upswing today, it's going to have a moral emphasis, a moral motivation behind it. It's likely going to be driven by the post-boomer generations, the young innovators who can lead us into a future. And it's going to have to be focused on rebuilding the most basic form of connection in our society, which is face-to-face bonds. And it's gonna happen at the grassroots, and it will not be led by an I alone political leader. So those are all the positive lessons from the progressive era, but it wasn't all positive, because any of you who were looking at those graphs going, oh, these wee decades, this grand upswing, that happened to correspond to a time in American history that was characterized by Jim Crow and a lot of racial exclusion and racial violence. And the fact of the matter is, the progressives, even though we laud them as having righted the ship and gotten a lot of things right, many of them were nonetheless racist, not exclusively, but largely. And so they were having this moral awakening, but that circle of moral concern really didn't extend to full inclusion. It didn't extend to peoples of color. And as a result of that, a lot of the structural inequality, structural racism that we are reckoning with today was knit into the systems and programs and reforms that these innovators put in place. And so the idea that we could sort of kick the racial reconciliation question down the road turns out to be a mistake that these innovators had made, and the upswing sort of had knit into it the seeds of its own demise from the perspective of not being racially inclusive. And I hope that we can have a chance to get into that in a little more detail a little later on. If we just go to the next slide here, what we want to leave you with is just this parting thought. These are the words of Teddy Roosevelt. He said, "The fundamental rule of our national life, the rule which underlies all others, is that on the whole and in the long run, we shall go up or down together. Whether we recognize it or not, whether we choose to live into it or not, we are in this together." And the more that we can lean into that and harness the power of our togetherness, the power of our we, the more likely we are to see another multifaceted upswing in America today.
Well, thank you. What a breathtaking tour through the book. One of the things that the book spends a fair amount of time with, and we don't want to go into this into great detail today, but I think it's quite interesting for us to just consider for a moment. When you talk about the cultural upswing, say a word or two about the methods that you've used to measure the I-we curve in a cultural dimension.
Actually, I'm more pleased about that chapter, Paul, than any of them, but it runs the risk of getting a little too nerdish. I am a nerd. But I'll say just briefly. We did use a lot of different measures, and some of them are the sort of more narrative measures that Shaylyn talked about. But we did discover a new technique. Other people used it too, but not as fully, I think, as we have. Google has digitized all books ever published, actually any place in the world, but certainly all books published over this period, the 1800s to now, and it's a huge database. There's a website, an app called Ngram. If you go to Ngram, you just type in any word that you're interested in, like, let's say laser. You type in laser there, and you can see how many times, as a fraction of the number of books published, how many times was that word laser used in any given year across this whole period. So if you take laser, for example, and do the graph across time, it's flat at essentially zero. Nobody was writing books about lasers until about 1955. And then it goes up, representing the existence of lasers and its discussion in American books. And then it begins to decline a little bit. And remember, this archive contains all sorts of books. So it does include some science books, but it's mostly, it's nonfiction, and it's children's literature, and it's gardening books, and it's cookbooks, and it's and a few books of social science, but they're trivial. So it's mostly not books in which you see words like communitarianism or individualism. It's mostly just ordinary, the kind of books you'd see in any bookstore or on any Amazon website. So now if you go, and so if you take, for example, if you take the word, let's take a more common word, the word the, which is actually one of the most common words in the English language and always has been, that chart looks like that. There has been no change in the relative frequency of the word the for the last, I don't know, 200 years in published language. So it's this is a kind of a measure of what people are writing about and what people are reading about over long periods of time. In that sense, it's an interesting, hard quantitative measure of culture. And I got the idea one evening sitting at my computer up in the woods of New Hampshire where I work. I thought, what's the simplest number we could use? What's the simplest check we could use here? And I got the idea of, suppose we just looked at the ratio of the first person plural pronoun to the first person singular pronoun. Just look at over time at the ratio of we to I. And I threw that graph up on my screen, and I was astonished. It was exactly the same as the curves that we've showed you. I mean, precisely the same. In fact, that's where the label for our curves comes from, because that was the original I, we, I curve. I was just looking, and it's low. People were only reading and writing books in which I don't mean only, of course, but there was a heavy emphasis on I in the 1890s. And then that rises, and by the time you reach the middle of the century in 1960, 65, actually it's 64, which is the peak by this measure, people are much more writing about books in which the word we appears. And then suddenly it follows exactly the same trend as all these others. It begins to sharply go down. And by now, Americans are reading and writing books in which we is a very uncommon pronoun and I is just all over the place. So, I mean, that was so hard for me to believe, actually, that I had a team of research assistants spend months trying to show what mistake I'd made, because I thought for sure I'd made some mistake here. We did it, and we hammered it, and I'm now pretty sure I'm not wrong. Maybe that's more than you want to know about the data creation, Paul. I can no longer see you, but that's the fact. Paul, are you there? Is anybody there?
Oh, there's Paul.
There's
Hello
Paul.
there.
Hi, Paul.
You lost me. Am I back?
You are back. Yeah.
Okay. We've had somehow my network failed. And so.
Oh, Garrett. Well, what you missed was in the chapter on culture, and I just described the engram. I can't hear you, Paul. You're muted.
Okay. I'm on. It says, am I there?
Now you are, yes.
We can hear you.
So, no, I've read the chapter, and I want everyone to be able to read the chapter and buy the book, The Upswing, and have the opportunity to learn about that. We actually got an interesting introduction to the engram analysis, quoting you when we had His Eminence, the Rabbi Sachs with us last year, just to his untimely passing. But he too was so taken by these cultural trends and changes. And this I'm recognizing we've got a little concern here in being able to share another graph now that I'm not on my computer. I'm on a different computer. But I do think it's going to be important for us to talk a bit about with the that graph.
We can do it without the graph, Paul. Don't worry about it.
Yeah.
Let's do it without the graph.
So when you left us really interested at that closing point, Shaylyn, when you said the I-we curve the we portion of it may not have been as inclusive, was definitely not as inclusive as what we would like. And, in some ways, the reaction against the conformity that we had in the 1950s.
Paul has gone.
Why don't I pick up the thread
Yeah,
and go ahead and dive into this? So I think what Paul is asking is for me to address who was we during this supposed we period, these we decades that we're talking about as this upswing, because no discussion of a we in American society can leave to the side the question of race and also gender. And so in the book, we have two separate chapters where we address race and gender and how changes in inclusion, racial inclusion and in gender inclusion, either reflect or refract this story of the we, I century. So let me just tell a little bit of the story of race, because I think there's some fascinating and surprising findings there. So as the 19th century began, when this story begins, the outlook for African Americans was incredibly bleak in America. A lot of people don't realize that right in the wake of Reconstruction, there was a lot of improvement, and we saw a lot of Black Americans entering the we. We had Black senators, and we had Black men serving in public office all over the country, and Black Americans starting to create wealth for themselves and other things. And then right after that happened, that progress sort of ripped away by Southern redemption, a period which, if you're not familiar with in history, I would recommend that you go and read more about this. This was the violent reclaiming of white hegemony on the part of white Southerners. A lot of the statues that are being debated as to whether we should tear them down were actually built during this redemption period when white Southerners were trying to pretend that the Civil War didn't quite happen the way that it actually did. So that's an interesting side note, just to pique your curiosity. And so again, incredibly bleak for African Americans. But when we have the view of the 20th century, we often have this idea that there was no progress during the early decades of the 20th century until we had the lightning bolt changes of the civil rights revolution. We have this idea that, contrary to our kind of inverted U curves that look like this, things got better and then got worse. We think that African Americans coming into the we looked like no change at all until the civil rights revolution. And we call that sort of a hockey stick measure, right? That's our idea of what happened. However, and it is important to acknowledge that on many measures, that's true. It was an incredibly exclusionary period, a very racialized we, particularly with regard to things like residential segregation, the longstanding lack of political representation for Black Americans, delayed entry into professional schools and professions, all of these things. And so those were the sort of not surprising findings. But when we looked at the data around material equality, when and how fast were Black Americans moving toward parity with white Americans on material measures, such as income and wealth and educational opportunity and health, and voter participation, for example, the data actually looked quite a bit different than that hockey stick cartoon narrative that we have. In fact, the period of 1940 to 1970 saw the greatest progress, the most rapid progress for Black Americans moving toward parity with white Americans. Now, granted, it was too slow. It was insufficient. We never got anywhere close to full equality. All of that being said, it's a surprising thing to think that during this Jim Crow period was actually when Black Americans were making the most progress toward material equality with whites. And that's one surprise. The other surprise, looking at the full century, is that right when the civil rights legislation passed, we were at the peak of the we, when we sort of had this fragile national consensus and were ready as a nation to widen the we and break down the legal barriers to integration. Right when that happened, you would think that these trends that were already going upward toward equality would have accelerated and moved even faster. The opposite turns out to be true. In the wake of the civil rights movement, we saw complete flatlining, stagnation, and even on some measures, a reversal of progress toward parity and equality between white and Black Americans, which gives you some idea of the backdrop to the Black Lives Matter protests. There is intense anger and frustration and disillusionment amongst Black Americans who thought that things were going to get better and better, and then they did not. this is also, I should point out that these findings are surprising to white Americans. These are not surprising to Black Americans. They lived this story, both that sort of move into the mainstream and then the stagnation that followed. And so it's important, I think, for white Americans to understand this, because often we look at and say, you know, oh, well, the civil rights movement happened. We solved that problem. Like, why is everybody so upset? Well, in fact, we didn't. And in fact, things have gotten quite a bit, quite a bit of stagnation when there should have been an acceleration. And so there's a lot more that we could say about this, but the point is that the story of I and we, when it comes to race, is a bit more complicated than you might think. But I think the biggest thing that we need to emphasize is that the progressives did not ever do the work of racial reconciliation. So even though there was a lot of progress made, it was not nearly enough. And there's a huge sort of call and imperative today for any idea of we that we might hope to rekindle or spark has to take full racial inclusion as its absolute core, not some sort of side thing that can be dealt with later on. So that's one of the important things that I think comes out of this story.
Well, this is so helpful, Shaylyn, to elucidate this. And I want to point out the book has a very full and interesting chapter on the issue of race and on the issue of gender as well, that where you go into these issues at some length. We are coming towards kind of the top of the hour here of our presentation here. And we are going to continue on with questions, but I do want those who will have other obligations, want to recognize that classes will be starting up at noon for some and they'll need to leave. But I really, before we hit the top of that hour, I think it's really important to think a bit about the youth-driven aspect of the progressive moment of inflection that you've pointed out as the beginning of the upswing. We have hundreds of BYU students on this today. What would be, and this is actually a question from, I think, maybe a BYU student, what is your greatest recommendation for current BYU students based on what your book is talking about here?
Shaylyn, do you mind if I jump on that
Please.
question right now, and then you can come back to it later too? Paul, this book, the whole purpose of this book, of our writing this book, was to speak to people like the people who are currently watching this, BYU students, not only BYU students, but including definitely BYU students. Because when we look back at this earlier period, what we see was, it was young people, we've already said this, but it's a big deal in the book. It was young people who led the movement out of this extreme individualism toward a more equal, less polarized, more egalitarian, more other-directed, other-centered, more altruistic society. It was young people who did that. It was young people who did it, first of all, because they knew that they had not caused the problems. Just like kids today, the kids in BYU, you didn't cause, it was not your generation that caused these problems at all. You're the innocent victims here. I mean that. But at the same time, it must fall to you as it fell to people just like you 125 years ago. They were the ones who had the innovative ideas that we're going to fix this. And so it would be tempting today, just as it must have been tempting to those people 125 years ago, to be cynical, to say, well, I didn't cause this, I'm going to go on to do something else, or I'm going to worry about myself, which would have been the worst possible thing to do. And that's not what they did for the most part. Those people realized they had a choice, as they phrased it, between drifting along with the tide of history, going down this path towards, ever darkening path, or they said it this way: we can just drift along, or we can try to master this current and go upstream and change the direction. And they did. That's the point I really want to make. What we call in the book agency, that is, the book says absolutely that history is not determinative. It wasn't determinative then. History might have gone in one direction, but because these kids, they were kids at the time, because those kids reached out and they did change the direction of our society, not just for a day or two, but for the next 70 years. It didn't happen overnight, and they had to be a little patient. They had to recognize that they were going to pivot, but when you pivot, you're still stuck in the same place. You're just pointing in a different direction. And they pivoted, and it wouldn't have happened without them. Mm-hmm. And now I am speaking, actually, I mean to be speaking to every kid, every person at BYU who's watching this. I'm speaking to you. The same thing that was true of them is true of you now. America's in a deep pickle. Everybody agrees it's a deep pickle. Deep pickle isn't the right phrase, but we are in a mess. And the only way we're going to get out of this, we can get out of it. We know we can get out of it. We've done it before, but the only way that that'll happen is if you personally get involved and change the course of history. You'll have to be farsighted. You'll have to have a more ambitious, you won't, because you're not going to do it overnight. But if, well, you know, every professor has an assignment, and you have easy assignments for the students that aren't so great, but you have tough assignments for the really good students. And I know the students at BYU are good students. So here's my assignment. I want you, not only over the next hour, but I want you over the next decade of your life to ask, what can we do now? What can I do in combination with all of my peers? What can we do to change the direction of America? Because you can do it. Mm-hmm. Okay, that's the end of my sermon, Paul. I'm sorry, I wasn't cut out to be a preacher, but
you are cut out to be a preacher. What a wonderful sermon for us here. As we come to the top of the hour, I'm going to recognize that we may lose some of our audience at this point, but what a stirring reminder. You may not know this, but there's kind of a motto for us here at Brigham Young University, which is enter to learn, go forth to serve. And with that in mind, I have a couple of questions here that relate to what you've just said, and I'd be interested in both of your thoughts on this. So Shaylyn, Robert, do you think that, this is from Jared Smith, he asks, do you believe that our generation is currently educated and well-versed enough morally to start a new upswing? And I want to combine that with a question that Ryan Kendrick is asking, because I think they're related. He says, when you refer to a moral reawakening to trigger a cultural upswing, does that refer specifically to traditional Christian values? What role do efforts to promote social justice, economic equality, and other moral topics of our modern society play in this reawakening?
Yeah.
And
I might start in on that one, if that's okay, Bob. So the question was about the first question was about moral education. Are we morally educated enough? I'm going to bring in some words of Jane Addams, who's one of my favorite progressives and led one of my favorite progressive movements, the settlement movement, the settlement house movement. She said, we are under a moral obligation in choosing our experiences, because it is our experiences that ultimately determine our understanding of life. And so whether or not we are morally educated does not have to do with how many books we've read. It actually has to do with how much we have engaged with the broader world and tried to really grapple with understanding it. And when I say the broader world, I mean engaging with human beings who are not like ourselves. So whether or not we are morally educated enough to undertake this upswing has everything to do with whether we are choosing to engage across lines of difference or not. That's a choice, right? We can say, oh, America is so segregated. Oh, we're so sorted. We're all in our echo chambers, and we can decry that. Or we can say, that's the reality that I've inherited. And I now choose to begin to change that by reaching across a line of difference, whether that is racial, whether that is gender, whether that is religious, whether that is political, you name it. And so I think the way that we engage in moral education and the way that the progressives engaged in moral education was to begin to inform themselves about problems and people that they did not immediately understand. So if you don't feel morally, I can't speak to whether your generation, and I say yours because I'm a little bit older than you, is morally educated enough. That's up to you. whether or not you're morally educated enough. So many of the progressives that we laud, they had these intense moral moments when things that they didn't previously understand came to their attention in a very dramatic way. That's true of Jane Addams. That's true of Frances Perkins. That's true of Ida B. Wells. Ida B. Wells was a famous Black American muckraker who, a friend of hers was lynched for no reason. And that launched her on a moral crusade to bring to light the horrors of lynching. And as a result of her efforts, the incidence of lynchings were reduced by something like 90% by the late 1920s in America. I mean, your choices matter. How you respond to the moral moments in your life, whether you respond to that call, is entirely up to you. And so I would urge you to pay attention to those moments that are coming into your awareness and ask yourself what you're being called to do as you feel those moral moments coming up for you.
Thank you so much. And Bob, go ahead. And then I want to bring some students on. Come on.
Well, I was going to just add, the other question that was asked was about, does this moral moment have to be Christian? And the answer is no, it wasn't then, and it doesn't have to be now. It began with evangelical Protestants, that's certainly true, but it spread rapidly but beyond them to other kinds of Christians, to mainstream Christians and to Catholics, and then spread it across all of American society. Well, not all of American society, but much of American society. And that will be true today. America is even more diverse religiously now than it was before. And it has to include Christians, but it can't be limited to Christians, or there's just not enough people and I actually happen to be Jewish, and I'd say as I spoke last night to a bunch of rabbis, I said, it's got to include us. And actually, if you look at the damn Bible, not the damn Bible, but what I mean is, if you look at what we all think of as scripture, some of the most egalitarian passages are part of the Jewish Bible. That is what we think of as the Torah. Anyway, it's not just about Christianity. And I want to say just one last word, because I make this point when I'm speaking to all religious audiences. I know, because I have written it, I proved it, that religious people are, controlling for everything else, nicer. That is, really, on average, going to church, connecting with other people in your religious community makes you, I'm going to make a causal statement, makes you more likely to help old ladies across the street, more likely to give to, and not just to put in the offering plate, but to give to secular causes, more likely to volunteer, but not just, in church, but also for secular things. But the same chapter, the same data analysis that shows that also shows that some religious people are define the we way too narrowly. Mm-hmm. So religious people are really good at we, but sometimes they define that we to mean we, us, only people in my sect. So religion is important. It's hard to see how we're going to fix this without involving religion, and non-Christian religion as well. But religious people, and especially Christians, need to be attentive to being sure that we're not defining that we in too narrow a way. Does that make sense, Paul?
It does. Thank you very much. Go ahead, Shaylyn, and then I want to bring some students on.
Yeah, I'm dying to make just another couple points here, because you've hit on my thing I'm most passionate about. I think it's important to remember that Christian theology is not one thing. I think one of the most fascinating stories of the I century is that Christian theology itself has been more I-focused or more we-focused over time. How we read the scriptures is up to us, right? Whether we're going to read the scriptures as Christ wanted us to check all of these boxes so that I could get into heaven and that's the end of it, or the prosperity gospel, which says God rewards the righteous with riches and you get to keep it for yourself because it's a symbol of your righteousness. That's one way to read Christian theology. There is another way to read it that informs social justice. There's the way that the Reverend William Barber is reading it as he engages in moral marches on Washington, calling upon Christian theology to inform the way that we organize society. So to the question of social justice, absolutely. But bear in mind that a rights-focused narrative around social justice resulted in the foot off the gas period, that stagnation in terms of racial progress, right? So focusing only on rights and what society owes to people may not get us where we need to be. Focusing on what we owe to each other and how we can come together is more likely to help us achieve the outcomes that we would want from a social justice perspective.
Okay, thank you so much. Let me ask, we're going to work through this technical issue and see whether this works or not. I'm hoping that Emily Magleby might be out there. And if we can bring Emily on, if she'll turn on her camera, and there she is. Emily is a sociology student here at Brigham Young University. She hails from Rexburg, Idaho. And Emily, what's your question for Shaylyn and Robert today, Bob?
Yeah, thank you. It's been great to hear from both of you. And I just had a question kind of just on what you were talking about, Shaylyn, about this idea of the I versus the we in terms of rights. I think many of us live in a culture kind of permeated by this notion that rights are really important. Identity politics kind of pervade today. So I'm curious if either of you have any recommendations of how we might kind of change these attitudes to focus more on the community versus kind of that rights-based focus of social justice.
Mm-hmm.
Although I do think rights are important.
Sure.
Go for it, Shaylyn.
Well, I think to answer this one, I might bring up the patron saint of community, Alexis de Tocqueville, right? So when we think about rights versus responsibilities, or duties versus rights, which is how the progressives would have put it, or community versus individualism, we often think of these as like some zero-sum game. Like it's either going to be one or the other. We are either a society that guarantees rights and privileges, or we are a society that is in it together and worries about each other and worries about, equality and connectedness. And what I think Alexis de Tocqueville's work, again, he was a French aristocrat that came to the United States in the 1830s to just observe, right? And what he saw was Americans had these twin ideals. They were incredibly rugged individualistic. That part of our mythology is not just a myth. That's a huge part of what America means. But then we were also engaging in a surprising number of associations. So how was it that we could be both individualistic and communitarian at the same time? And he came up with a concept to reconcile those two called self-interest rightly understood. So the idea is that we can't, if we relentlessly pursue self-interest, we ultimately run into a situation where it's not actually in our best interest to do that. What's in our interest is to actually think about our interconnectedness and how we have to work together to bring about the greatest good for everyone, right? And so there's a balance there between these two concepts. And so what we're not saying that we shouldn't focus, what we are not saying is don't focus on rights. Rights are not important. We think that rights and individual liberties are super important. The problem is that our narratives have gotten completely out of whack, where we're totally emphasizing one and completely underplaying the other. What we need is not the solution to hyper-individualism or hyper-rights-based narratives is not hyper-communitarian narratives, but rather something that brings us back into that delicate American balance, which is what always has made us so unique. And so again, it's about getting the right balance so that it's not just a war of the we's, we're all fighting for our piece of the pie, but rather recognizing that we all need our rights guaranteed, but when we work together, that pie can actually grow. That's what the data shows.
Can I just add briefly another aspect of exactly what we're talking about here, but linking it specifically to Utah and to Mormons, because Mormons are proud of rugged individualism. And that is sometimes symbolized, I don't mean among Mormons, but it's sometimes it's symbolized by the lone cowboy opening the West by riding across, Gary Cooper or whatever, riding across the West. But actually, and Mormons know this, the right symbol for opening the West was the wagon train. And so even though Mormons are rightly proud of the rugged individualism of their culture, in fact, their culture, and you all know this, I don't mean everybody here is Mormon, but people in Mormons know this. The wagon train that came to the Salt Lake Valley was a wagon train, and you wouldn't have got there had you not been a community. And so that notion that there's not an opposition between rugged individualism and community, you have to worry about the balance, but there's not that it's all one or all the other, is built into I'm not a Mormon, and I actually do not think that Mormonism is perfect, but I do think that in this respect, it's got the right idea that you've got to have an integrated balance between rugged individualism and focus on community. Does that make sense, Emily? I hope so.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Emily, for your question. I'm now going to ask Andrew Ree, who hails from Great Falls, Virginia. Andrew, are you out there?
Yes, I am. Thank you both. First of all, thank you both for coming and speaking to us today. I was particularly struck by one of the graphs that we showed earlier, looking at sort of economic equality, and that the sort of high point of economic equality lined up with these sort of high points with unity and community. And I just wonder what you both think about the role economic equality plays in sort of bringing us together today, particularly because I think so many of those conversations that we're having right now around that seem to be so divisive.
Yeah, I think either of us could go. I'm Shaylyn, as you know, I'm going to have to cut off here at another 5 or 10 minutes, and you'll have a little longer to stay. So I'll say a word, but I don't have the last word on this topic. First thing to remember, Andrew, as we said, is that economics is a lagging variable, not a leading variable, by which I mean it's not that economics is likely to cause something else. It's what is likely to cause us as a society to put more emphasis on economic equality. And that story, it's not the first one that comes to the mind of a sociologist or of an economist or political scientist, but it actually makes total sense. It's only if we begin thinking about other people as kind of, like us, and it's an us. It's not just I, me, that we're likely to shift to paying attention to making sure that the economy is working for everybody. And that means both thinking purely in terms of the private sector, and it means also in terms of government involvement. Government involvement actually is crucial to making all this work, but it's not sufficient. And I want to use a quick reference here to two folks who are distant relatives of Shaylyn, namely George Romney and Mitt Romney. You've surely heard of Mitt Romney. Have you also heard of George Romney? I'm just interested whether you've heard of George Romney. George Romney was Mitt Romney's father. Mitt, like George, like Mitt, George Romney was a very successful, wealthy entrepreneur. In his case, it was a car business. In Mitt's case, it's other more recent things. And they were both devout Mormons. And they both were generous. But George, because he was growing up in a different era, he had come of age during the Wheat era. George was incredibly egalitarian. He made a lot of money, but he gave most of it back, and he insisted that his salary not be more than some modicum ratio to his frontline workers. And he both of them were generous, but George gave away a ton of money because his view, not because he was Mormon or not because but because of the age in which he came, his view was it wasn't just government's responsibility to make sure, it was the job of ordinary rich people. They should be worried in their own lives. Because we were all morally equal, they should be concerned about making that happen in their generation. Mitt Romney, who actually I admire a lot actually, nevertheless came of age in a different era, and he doesn't really have that same commitment to egalitarianism. His politics are different than his father's. His politics, especially on the distribution of income, are different from his father's. So I'm not saying that at all to make comments about the Romneys, much less about Mormons. I'm trying to make a comment about how it's not just government, but it's also what we do in our private, personal lives that affects the economic outcome. Does that make sense, Andrew? And Shaylyn, you may or may not want to comment on your relatives, but do you want to say anything more?
I mean, Just that economists like Paul Krugman have actually documented this phenomenon that they call the outrage factor, which was a big part of mid-century America, right? That there was a certain point at which it was outrageous for a CEO to make so much more than everyone else. That's a cultural thing, right? Informing an economic reality. And we don't have that outrage factor anymore. We just don't. And as a result, it's completely fine for people to make massive amounts of money when those on the front lines are struggling. And so the Romneys, I think, are a particularly elegant example of this, but it's a phenomenon that goes well beyond them.
And let me just close quickly on that point. That could change.
Mm-hmm.
That is, whether it's outrageous that some people are making billions and billions and, huge amounts of money and have enormous wealth, and that doesn't cause outrage, that could change. It could change, especially if some of them begin saying that it's outrageous. But would also change, I mean this, Andrew, if people in your generation begin to disrespect that, or to put it a different way, begin to respect a lot more rich folks who are working hard to make sure that they're not so much richer than everybody else. I mean, this is not something that's determined by God or something. It's determined by our actions, by your actions, especially this issue of outrage.
One thing I just want to note, and I know, Bob, you're going to need to head out here. On the economic issues, the curve that is portrayed in the book is about equality. It's not about GDP per capita, for example, right? So if we had followed GDP per capita, we would see a very different kind of curve. Is that correct, Bob?
No, that's actually, I am going to have to leave pretty quickly, and it's a smart question. I'm not trying to diss the question by the fact that I'm going to answer it. People often think we have to choose. We can either have equality or we can have rapid growth, but we can't have both. That was factually false. America's highest growth rates during the 20th century were all unambiguously happening during the wheat period. And our lowest growth rates, and I'm talking about what you're talking about, that is GDP per capita growth, just how much are we growing? Our lowest growth rates were without doubt all concentrated in the I periods of American history. So it's just factually false. And I know there are a lot of economists who don't understand this, and a lot of business people who don't understand this, but it's just true. It's better for the whole economy, the whole darn country, if we're focused more on sharing than we're focused on what they would call the incentives. But the incentives for growth are, I don't doubt there are some, but they're dwarfed by the thing I'm talking about, which is, are we all in this together, or are we out for ourselves? It's just a factually false claim that we have to, not blaming you on this on you, Paul, but it's a factually false claim to believe we have to choose between growth and equality. In the court, if you look at the whole damn 20th century, sorry, I'm getting carried away here. If you look at the whole 20th century, the only time we had high growth was when we had high equality, and vice versa.
Okay. Well,
please forgive me. I get carried away when I feel strongly and I use impure language.
Bob, we've really benefited from this, and Andrew, thank you for your question that allowed us to bring out those important points. Thank you. I think we're going to be drawing this now to kind of a close here. Really appreciate all who've made this work. Bob needs to leave. He has another important appointment to get to. So Shaylyn, it's you and me here at the end. Mm-hmm. We this is actually kind of fun because I think it would be helpful for our audience actually to just get a sense of how it is that you and Robert Putnam connected. Mm-hmm. And then again, I'd like to get your kind of account about what students, I really want you to think about the students, and we talked about this in a previous webinar of ours with Yuval Levin about, I used the story of Frances Perkins running towards the fire in that factory and how that changed her life.
Yeah.
if you could give us a sense of what you think are those pivot points for students today, how they can find a calling, if we can use that term, that they might engage in to improve the world.
Yeah. So, to your first question, a little bit about how Bob and I got to writing this book. I was an undergraduate 20 years ago when Bowling Alone came out in the year 2000. I took Bob's now famous Community in America seminar as a young, wide-eyed sophomore who had come from the West. I grew up in Colorado, and I was captivated by this idea that community had unraveled. And it was a particularly captivating idea having grown up LDS, right? Where community is such an important part of our lives. It was really fascinating to see that experience of really strong community bonds that I had was not the experience that the average American was having, right? And it really captured my imagination. I ultimately went on to write about the progressive era for my senior thesis, which Bob advised. I wrote about the settlement house movement. And then, I've worked with and for Bob in various capacities over the years, including working on American Grace, in which I had the great privilege of traveling all over the country and doing deep ethnographic research on religious communities to try and bring to light what religiosity looks like in lived experience. And that you can read those vignettes if you're interested in American Grace. And when it comes to the upswing, Bob had discovered these curves. And really, it's a little bit hard probably for students to understand this, but I think specialists in these fields realize that it's very rare from a statistical standpoint to see such totally disparate phenomena as economics, politics, culture, and society to actually track the same trajectory over such a long period of time. It's a genuinely breathtaking statistical finding. And so Bob had sort of discovered this, and at the time he and his agent were calling these 5 charts in search of a story. And I came in to really help put the story around this and to remind, Bob never wanted to write a Make America Great Again book. But it's a little bit easy to look at these curves and go, oh, what we want to do is hark back to another time period when everything was great in America. And we have a lot of narratives in this country today calling for that type of change that is a backward looking change. And that was never the book that Bob wanted to write. And so by placing the emphasis on the progressive era, on the time that was so similar to the one that we're living in now, and asking how they pulled up and out of that mess before, and how we could do it again, was really sort of my part of this project. And I would encourage your students to go and read the introduction. If you don't read any other part of the book, which you might not because you have so much to read as students, read that introduction, because what it is a narrative account of what it was like to live during the Gilded Age. And I think it will take your breath away in terms of how similar that moment in American history feels to how we feel today. I was shocked when I did that research. So the question then becomes, if we're living in this, yeah.
I want to ask this.
Yeah.
You use this term, the second Gilded Age.
Mm-hmm.
Did you coin that term for this book?
I don't know if we've coined that term or not. There actually has been a lot written about the Gilded Age repeating itself. We were not the first people to spot that. We were not the first people to write about that. But mostly the people who have written about it, or who had written about it before the upswing, were focusing just on that economic inequality piece. That was what characterized the Gilded Age, was the vast gap between rich and poor, and that has been repeating itself in the last couple of decades. Well, we now know it's been repeating itself for much longer than that. But I think what we add to this story about this being a second Gilded Age is that it wasn't just the economics. It was also the politics. It was also the social fabric, and it was also the culture of narcissism. Those are the pieces that I think writers and commentators hadn't really spotted before this came on the scene.
And then my question, I asked you 2 questions. I've asked you about 3 questions. Your thoughts about where students might make a difference, how they might make a difference.
Yeah, so in the conclusion of the book, we worked really hard to think about how could we tell the story of the progressives in a way that was relatable in a way that didn't make them seem like these heroes that are inaccessible from another time. And so in the conclusion to the book, we opted to write a series of sort of personal portraits of different progressive reformers. And what I found so fascinating is of course, we looked at tons and tons of these people that we could write about in the book and then boiled it down to a handful. But what was so similar about all of them was, as you mentioned, Frances Perkins is a great example. They were just living their lives, kind of drifting along. Bob referenced the book Drift and Mastery earlier in the program. That's a book that was written by Walter Lippmann in 1914 at the height of this kind of progressive moment in American history. And the point of that book is to say we have a choice. We can either drift along with the current of history, assuming that we have no control, or we can master the moment. So drift and mastery was Walter Lippmann's call for people to get in there and master the moment, right? And to use their individual agency to change the direction of society. So you have all these examples of women like Frances Perkins. I mean, she had basically decided that she was just going to marry a wealthy philanthropist and maybe do some good by donating money here and there to important causes. She was actually attending a tea for ladies, at this fancy mansion on Washington Square. If any of you have been to New York, you'll know Washington Square. It's sort of a square park that's surrounded by these beautiful homes and apartment buildings. So she was in one of these homes having tea with her fellow philanthropic friends, and the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory had caught on fire, and it was sort of on the corner of Washington Square, and there was this big commotion outside. She ran outside to see what was happening, and she saw young immigrant women who were largely the employees of this factory jumping to their deaths to avoid being killed by this fire. And it was not long before this that these immigrant women had actually organized themselves, had done some strikes and called for greater safety measures to be implemented in that factory, and their calls were ignored. And as a result, it caught fire, and hundreds of women, young women, lost their lives. And Frances Perkins just had this moment where she said, I can't do this. I can't sit on the sidelines of this fight. I have to get in there and use my life to fight the good fight, essentially. And all of these different reformers that we highlight, they had different skill sets, they had different passions, they had different histories and pedigrees, they were of different races, of different social classes, but they all had this one thing in common, which was when they were confronted with the injustice, they couldn't sit on the sidelines anymore, and they got in there and they did something about it. Historians have called the progressive movement so diverse as to be barely coherent. What that means is that hundreds, if not thousands of people were answering a call that was unique to them. And they were doing what they felt their purpose was to move us in a different direction as a society. So there's no one right way here. The question is simply, in those moments of choice in your life, are you going to do what's best for you and say, well, everybody's just on their own, and this just happens to be best for me, and good luck to everyone else? Or are you going to say, maybe this is a moment when I could make a personal sacrifice and do something that might benefit others? I've had lots of those moments in my life. My life is the reason my story and my career is so unorthodox is because I've been confronted with these moral moments many times. And my hope is that I've answered them in a way that at the end of my life, I'll be proud of. But I think that that's all that matters in the end. And the more people we can get to do this, the more that people we can get to engage in this type of life choice, the more likely we are to see this as the culture change and the society to move in a different direction.
Well, Shaylyn, what a wonderful way to end today. We appreciate your idealism and your preparation for being able to be a part of this extraordinary effort to bring to light the full scope of the 20th century in a most interesting way, with Robert Putnam, of course, one of the truly great scholars of American politics. So thank you. We're grateful for those who've been with us to the end here. And again, the book is The Upswing, How America Came Together a Century Ago and How We Can Do It Again. Thanks for everyone. We'll see you at our next webinar. Thanks, Shaylyn.
Thanks, Paul. Thank you so much.